From frost to full bloom, 2024 was a season of growth, challenges, and delicious rewards. Back in March, we built the Frost to Bloom garden from the ground up, with plans to share updates throughout the season. But between building a greenhouse, caring for a family member with dementia, and tackling Christmas DIYs, time slipped away. Now as we gear up for the 2025 garden, I'm taking a moment to reflect on last year's journey, the lessons learned, the surprises along the way, and I'll even share some recipes I made using our fresh garden produce. Now as we wait for the frost to thaw, our Frost to Bloom garden has gone through a full cycle, from the winter of 2024 to bloom and then winter again. Looking back to the beginning of our harvest season, June 2024 feels like a lifetime ago. After spending so much time getting the garden into the ground, it seemed as though it took forever for the garden to really get going. Spring did come late to Minnesota last year. The Minnesota Department of Natural Resources called March the revenge of the lost winter, as we went from a heat wave in early March to winter snowstorms at the end of March. Once summer arrived, we faced an unseasonably rainy pattern. In fact, most of the summer was characterized by flood watches and flood warnings. The flood warnings weren't just hyperbole. Summer 2024 actually set a record as the fourth wettest in Minnesota history. Using the Minnesota DNR's own words, Minnesota went from a wet and warm spring to an extremely wet June, which was later updated to a massively wet June. And according to the National Weather Service, between June 1st and July 15th, there were a total of 30 days of rain. Needless to say, we did not spend as much time in the garden as we would have liked this past summer. Even without excessive rain, our yard has a tendency to flood. It's not uncommon for a small stream to appear as an additional water feature in our yard when we get a heavy rain, but this year we even got a temporary waterfall for a day or two. The good news is that, excessive though it was, the heavy rains ended what had been an extended drought, so although my time working in the garden got canceled repeatedly because of the rain, it was a reminder that gardeners work hand in hand with Mother Nature, and gardening is often an adventure filled with the unexpected. On the other hand, the crazy weather, the lack of sun, and the overall general soggy conditions really acted to slow the garden's progress. The rain also created excellent conditions for pests. The slugs love to come out, especially after a rain. Our strategy for dealing with slugs was to use a kaolin clay wash on our plants, an idea that we got from James Prigioni's channel. It worked really well, but because of the frequent rains, we couldn't keep up with all the reapplications needed. Eventually, we stopped applying the clay, although it was effective, which meant that quite a few of our plants got eaten up. In particular, the slugs seemed to like our Arikara bush beans and the corn. I know there are other methods to deter slugs, but we just never got around to them, and luckily it didn't seem to affect the plant production too much. On the topic of pests, slugs weren't the only ones interested in our garden. One of the challenges in growing in our area, as well as the reason for our failed attempt at a garden in 2015, is that we have an abundance of wildlife in the area. Deer, turkey, rabbits, birds, squirrels, and plenty of other animals frequently visit our yard. I love the fact that we get to experience nature in our own backyard, but that presents a challenge if we want there to be any food left over to enjoy for ourselves. For example, while a majority of our garden was protected with a mesh perimeter, we did have 2 unprotected raised beds. We lost our first round of lettuce and quite a few pumpkin starts to hungry animals. We added 2 pinwheels from Dollar Tree to help deter rabbits to one bed, which seemed to help a bit, but only when the wind was blowing. Eventually, we got around to covering the bed with a garden cloth, and we were pleased to see our carrots, onions, and celery finally got a chance to grow without getting mowed down. Once the garden did start producing, we discovered that we had a mystery thief. The thief was somehow getting into the protected garden area, so I think it may have been a squirrel. A few strawberries were taken, ground cherries, and the garden thief even sampled a jalapeno, though it didn't seem to enjoy it. We might not have ever realized that we had a garden thief, except that they left evidence in the form of half-eaten strawberries under the leaves of our purple potato plant. Although we never caught the thief in the act, it became a part of our garden routine to check that spot for any new signs of looting. Before you accuse me of squirrel profiling, I did do some research on likely suspects. I learned that squirrels like freshly dug dirt and can eat newly planted seeds. They also steal tomatoes, strawberries, and plenty of other garden produce. While I'll never know for sure if the culprit was a squirrel, it's good to know what to expect when gardening in an area of abundant nature. And in the grand scheme of things, figuring out the strawberry culprit didn't matter much anyway. Although we planted over 40 strawberry plants, our harvest was modest. Beyond competing with the garden thief, we just didn't get many berries. What we did get were beds of thick, healthy strawberry leaves that grew beautifully all summer. I'm not sure why our berries didn't put out fruit. We've never had this issue in the past. For the record, we grew 3 different varieties of strawberries: the AC Wendy, a June-bearing variety, and the Jewel and Honeyoy variety, which should have produced throughout the summer. If anyone knows what might have caused the issue, put your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know. Anyway, if you're a Frost to Bloom gardener like me, then you know that June is a month where a lot of gardening YouTubers start showing off their massive harvest. While it's fun to watch, it can be pretty disheartening because unless you grow in a greenhouse or from starts, Frosted bloom harvests are usually still months away. Plus, with all the rain, our frosted bloom garden was still in its early stages. We were starting to get some peppers and some ground cherries from starter plants that we bought at one of the nursery stores. I started some lime basil from seed to fill in the gaps left by our failed Tigger melons, which we had started indoors along with more direct sown ground cherries. By July, I was hoping to have a nice radish harvest and promised an update on it. Unfortunately, like our other direct-sown plants, the radishes didn't grow so hot. We planted the French breakfast variety, but they were stringy, with only a few of them developing spheres. Last time I mentioned that our cucumbers needed more nitrogen, so we made sure that we supplemented the soil to give them a boost. Turns out nitrogen can hamper radish growth. So there's a lesson in companion planting. Some people say that companion planting isn't scientifically proven, so it's not worth adhering to. But I think there can be some truth to it. For example, it's clear cucumbers and radishes don't go well together because they have different needs. On the other hand, our corn and squash crops grew really well. We planted this garden bed using the Three Sisters companion planting methodology. Originally cultivated by indigenous peoples across North America, the Three Sisters method plants squash, corn, and climbing beans together. The idea is that the beans fix nitrogen in the soil for the other plants and helps to stabilize the corn. The squash's leaves provide shade for the ground and keep the soil moist. Our approach wasn't exactly the same, but we did plant some lemon squash on one side of the bed and several varieties of corn on the other side. By mid-July, it was by far our best growing garden bed with plenty of squash blossoms forming and some corn cobs with silks ready to be fertilized. We made sure to shake the pollen down onto the silks, hoping to get good fertilization. Corn is usually wind pollinated, but since we have a small crop, we wanted to make sure it was getting pollinated, especially since every silk represents a kernel of corn. In addition to the corn and squash, this bed had some sweet peas at the edge, though they never really produced anything but some pretty flowers. We also had borage, which took a while to bloom, but was pretty when it finally did. And after watching a fascinating video from the University of California about soil biodiversity, I decided to try planting red okra in the same bed. The video mentioned a farm near Hollister, California, whose dirt was being studied for its biodiversity. The farm incorporates okra as part of the Three Sisters rotation. I decided to give this a try. I added okra that we started from seeds in the spring but never moved into the garden. It was still hanging on, though a bit leggy. I also direct sowed some seeds as well. However, the corn had already grown quite tall by the time I did this, so it didn't really thrive in this area because it was shaded out. On July 12th, our greenhouse kit came in. We were hoping the rainy period was coming to an end so we could get a start on the greenhouse. We actually had our first rain-free week this week, only to be met with scattered thunderstorms on the weekend. It wasn't until the end of July that we were able to get a solid start on the greenhouse. But in the meantime, my dad had started marking out where we planned it to be. The yard slopes down a bit, so he spent a lot of time measuring and marking so that we could level the area properly. For this greenhouse, we planned to build a 3-foot wall and place the greenhouse kit on top of it to give it more height. We used dirt from the big load we got at the beginning of the season to start leveling out the area according to the measurements my dad made. With the rain clearing up at the end of July, we were finally able to get out in the garden and do some much needed trellising of our cucumber plants. They had been growing well and had lots of flowers, but were becoming a mess of vines on the ground. We planted Rhenish, potato, lemon, and cucamelon varieties. Getting the cucumbers off the ground made it easier to see the cucumbers and added some nice verticality to our garden. As the cucumbers grew out, they created a nice vining wall feature that I really enjoyed. I was also able to get to some much needed weeding. While I thought the garden had filled out well, it turned out a lot of the green I was seeing were weeds. I ended up pulling up a lot of nightshades. I hesitated to pull it up before because we had also planted ground cherries and tomatoes, both in the nightshade family. The plants looked similar to me, so I was nervous to pull them. It wasn't until they started producing berries that I was sure they were the nightshade weeds, and I pulled them with glee. Heading into August, our garden was starting to look like a proper garden, with good growth on everything. While it was mostly a blooming garden at this point, we were able to harvest a few strawberries and some jalapenos and sweet peppers, as well as a few ground cherries. Our arikara, garbanzo, and lima beans were also starting to come in, along with a few tiger tomatoes. We started August off with a bulk order from a local farm. I thought it was interesting that they sent out a notice saying they had also struggled with the heavy rain and flooding, so some of their crops were delayed. Further proof of some of the struggles we saw in our own garden. We picked up a load of jalapenos, onions, corn, and tomatoes, especially since our tomatoes were nowhere near close to coming in yet. We blanched the corn and froze them so we could enjoy them well into the winter. I also saved the corn silk for corn silk tea. It's a really light and refreshing drink. To prep the silk for tea, wash your corn silks well, then let them dry. When ready for tea, just boil some corn silk and water. The amount is up to you. It tastes lightly sweet and grassy and can help with high blood pressure, inflammation, and is full of antioxidants, among other purported benefits. Even though we supplemented our garden with an order from a local farm, August was when we were finally able to begin enjoying some of our own harvests. We got our first cucumber harvest in early August, which was exciting. They were mostly of the Rhenish variety, but we also got what I'm thinking were some hybrid cucumbers, a mix between the potato and lemon cucumbers we planted in the same bed. We were confused at first and ended up just assuming they were the lemon ones, though we were wondering what happened to all of the potato cucumbers we planted and why we hadn't gotten any of those. It actually wasn't until the end of August when we got what was clearly a purely lemon cucumber that we began to think there may have been cross-pollination going on. In any case, all the cucumbers have been delicious, hybrid or not. We also started to get some lemon squash coming in early August. We really enjoyed this variety of squash. It's very mild and slightly sweet. Some of our corn was looking about ready to pick, and our pumpkin squash bed really took off with leaves growing big on our kabocha and black futsu. In fact, we had our first kabocha growing, which was exciting to see. Unfortunately, our delicata pretty much all died off, but it was reassuring to know that we would get at least one kabocha. This garden bed also housed some zinnia flowers we planted. They had been growing all summer but had yet to bloom. As it was already August, I was beginning to doubt that they would, but lo and behold, we finally got our first zinnia bloom, which was awesome. Another fun harvest was the wild black cherries growing on our black cherry tree. A few years ago, it started producing black cherries, but they are really sour on their own and don't have much fruit around the pit. The birds do enjoy them though. This past year, I had been experimenting with a Korean maceration technique called Cheong. In Korean, it can stand for syrups, fruit preserves, and marmalades, and is often used as a cold remedy or as a sugar substitute. Basically, if you've ever put sugar on strawberries and used the syrup, this is a maceration technique. The only difference is that Cheong is done for a length of time, so it becomes fermented. This past summer, I made a plum, peach, and grape Cheong and thought the black cherries would be a perfect candidate to try with the Cheong technique. To make a Cheong, you need equal parts sugar to fruit by weight. I was able to harvest about 9 ounces of black cherries, so I added the same amount of sugar and mixed it. Store in a container that can breathe. This is important because my plum one almost exploded. Luckily, we caught it in time. Let it ferment at room temperature until all the sugar is dissolved. You can move the container around every few days to help the sugar dissolve, and if need be, you can use a clean spoon to stir it occasionally. If you don't like a super strong fermented taste, you can keep it in the fridge after a day or two to slow fermentation. Since this is my first time making it, I'm by no means an expert, so I'll share 2 videos I watched on the process in the description box below. You can add the syrup to sparkling water for a healthier take on a soda, add them to hot or cold tea for flavor and as a sweetener. For example, I used the peach Cheong for iced tea and the plum Cheong for hibiscus tea, which was delicious. We also used the black cherry Cheong in a hot tea when my grandma and brother got a summer cold. The black cherry is particularly good because it's anti-inflammatory, and actually the bark of a cherry tree is used in cough medicine. This is also why cherry is a common medication flavor. Anyway, the Cheong was a much more delicious cold remedy that soothes some minor symptoms. And of course, since Cheong is fermented, it also has added benefits for your gut because it has probiotics. On August 10th, the guys got a solid start on the greenhouse. My dad rented an auger to help drill 6 feet holes into the foundation. Because we live in a cold climate, we had to dig that deep to get past the frost line, otherwise the foundation could shift as the ground thaws and freezes. While my dad did that, I planted some seeds for a fall crop. We were enjoying the bounty of cucumbers, so decided to try and get some more exotic varieties that hadn't taken earlier in the season. I planted jelly melon cucumbers, more cucamelon since the ones we planted never showed up, and an Indian variety called Puna Kira. I also planted another round of radishes, Lady Slipper and China Rose, this time in our strawberry bed, with hopes they would grow better than our first attempt. I harvested our arikara bush beans as well as some of our azuki beans. I replaced the Arikari bush beans with purple hull beans. Meanwhile, the auger kept getting stuck on rocks, and it took my dad, my brother, and me to get it unstuck. This was probably one of the more difficult parts of the greenhouse project. It took about a week for my dad to get all 6 holes drilled, and it was pretty tough work, though the auger did make it easier. As for the beans I harvested, the Arikara bush beans looked really nice, though we didn't get enough to make a huge batch of anything. We will probably just end up throwing them into a soup at some point. The zuki beans were also super tiny, but it was just fun to be able to grow beans even though the actual yield was small. Beans are something I'd definitely like to grow more of this year. By mid-August, we were getting some blooms on our crimson sweet watermelon, but with summer sunlight running out, I doubted anything would come of it. Our moon and stars watermelon ended up getting shaded out by the lima beans we planted over there, so while it's still hanging in there, it didn't grow that much. However, the beans and radish I had planted only a week before had already sprouted. Excitingly, our first corn was ready to be picked. This is a strawberry popping corn. Since it was our first time growing corn, I didn't know much about when to pick it, but I learned that when the tassels turn brown is a good indicator. Or you can do a milk test by peeling back the husks and gently pressing a kernel. If it releases a milky liquid, it should be ready. I don't know if that applies to a popcorn variety, but we did get some kernels on this one, and that was about as successful as it got. We had one small early bantam corn, but most of the corn we got wasn't pollinated well with basically no kernels, so that was disappointing, especially since we had tried to make sure all the silks were getting pollinated. I did some additional research and found out that when planting corn, it's recommended to stick to one variety of corn, as popcorn and sweet corn can cross-pollinate and make for popcorn that doesn't pop well and sweet corn with the wrong flavor and texture. If you do want to plant multiple varieties in the same garden, you can stagger the corn varieties, which I think we ended up doing inadvertently. We started our early bantam corn indoors and direct sowed our other varieties. However, the direct sowed varieties grew faster than the ones we started indoors and ended up getting its pollen first. I really enjoyed growing the corn. It was a beautiful plant and was really fun to watch grow. For a long time, it was the only thing doing well in the garden, but the actual harvest we got was a bit disappointing. I did feel better seeing corn at our local farmers market, as it also looked to be on the smaller side. I'm not sure if we will try growing corn again this year. While we didn't get a great yield, it did bring me joy to watch it grow, so we will see what we end up doing. And we did get one popping corn. In order to pop it, it has to dry out, so I removed the husk and let it air dry for about a month. Unfortunately, I was unsuccessful at getting it to pop, so that was also a bust. Beyond the corn fails, more and more zinnia started to bloom, and we were starting to get some beautiful looking tomatoes coming in, as well as a lot of ground cherries. I thought that the ones I planted from seed hadn't made it, but suddenly there were 2 ground cherry plants in our strawberry bed in addition to the plants we bought, so I don't know how I missed them for so long. It seems like they just sprouted overnight. I had ended up planting lime basil over there because I didn't think it had worked out. Even so, I did only get 2 plants out of about 6 I seeded. So it was more of a miss than a hit. I would like to plant ground cherries again next year. They were always a fun part of visiting the garden because at least 3 or 4 of them would be ready each day. I would like to try making ground cherry jam this year, but since the berries don't mature at the same rates, it can be hard to collect enough to make a jam all at once. We also decided to harvest one of our purple potato bags. It was a bit early. A lot of people wait until the plants die off, but we were antsy to have some potatoes, so we did them early and got a pretty good yield, I'd say. The purple potatoes were really tasty too. By the end of August, my dad was able to start filling the holes he had dug with cement, which was a big step for being able to build the greenhouse. If you're enjoying this video, don't forget to give it a like. It really helps more people find it. And if you love discovering enchantment in everyday life, be sure to subscribe to Always Uttori for more fashion, food, DIYs, and lifestyle inspiration. I'd love to have you as part of our community. By the time September rolled around, it seemed like the summer we had been waiting for had finally arrived. We had balmy 70-degree weather, sunny days, and the garden hit its peak production. We got some of our largest harvest in September. Because there weren't as many garden tasks to do in September except enjoy the lavish bounty, we started hitting the greenhouse construction hard. We got the foundation wood laid out and aligned, then cut to the correct size. Before securing it to the cement foundation pillars, we double-checked everything was square and aligned properly. You can also see that some of the wood, particularly on the far side of the greenhouse, looks raised. This is because the yard slopes, so those areas needed to be filled in for the greenhouse to sit flush. Once the wood was secured to the concrete, we filled in the holes with dirt. Next was the framing for the walls. This part of the greenhouse was about 3 feet, and the guys attached plywood boards to the frame to serve as the outer wall. It was really starting to feel like we were building a greenhouse. It felt a bit like a far-off dream, but with walls going up, it was really happening. In the garden, our raspberries were doing well, and a few of them produced a long cane, which means we will hopefully get berries on the cane this year. One of our lemon squash plants ran its course and bit the dust, so we were down to just one. Meanwhile, we were still getting plenty of cucumbers, including our cross-pollinated varieties, but I finally found a pure potato cucumber that hadn't been cross-pollinated. I wanted to discuss this because I have watched more than a few gardening videos, including ones on growing cucumbers specifically, and I haven't seen anyone mention cross-pollination between cucumbers when growing different varieties close together. When I did some additional research, it seems like this is likely because cross-pollination doesn't often affect the plant in a negative way. The biggest issue seems to be between parthenocarpic or seedless cucumber varieties. However, while production of our cucumbers weren't affected by cross-pollination, the overall look and perhaps taste of the cucumbers were, so if you really want your varieties to present with the correct attributes, perhaps some separation is in order. This was definitely a beginner gardener's mistake. In addition to finding our potato cucumber, I also discovered some of the cucamelons we planted. I don't know where they had been hiding until then, but it was a nice surprise to see one of our fun varieties made it. These were so cute and looked like tiny watermelons, hence the name. They were a bit more on the bitter side in terms of taste, but they were very fresh and crisp. With all the cucumbers we had, it was time to make some pickles with our cucumber harvest. It did take a few weeks of saving the cucumbers until we had enough to make a batch of pickles, but by the end of summer, we had more than enough cucumbers. I'd say it's been our most prolific crop. I made 3 types of pickles. For the first recipe, I used a dill pickle recipe from America's Test Kitchen. Unfortunately, while we planted dill, it ended up dying. It got shaded out by the cucumbers because we planted it in the same bed. I was able to scrounge up some of the remnants of the mammoth dill we planted, but had to use mostly dried dill, which was a bit of a bummer. To make the pickles, cut the cucumbers into spears. The recipe calls for 2.5 pounds. Toss it with 2 tablespoons of pickling salt and let sit for 3 hours, then drain the water and pat dry. In a spice satchel, add 2 cups of chopped dill, then place that, 3 cups of apple cider vinegar, 3 cups of water, 1/4 cup of sugar, 1 tablespoon of mustard seed, and 2 teaspoons of dill seed into a saucepan and bring to a boil. Remove from the heat, cover, and let infuse for 15 minutes. Prep your jars by simmering them in boiling water to sterilize. Let them dry on a dish towel, then fill the jars with the cucumber spears, additional dill sprigs, and 4 garlic cloves. Briefly heat the pickling brine up again so it's hot, then pour over the cucumbers, leaving about 1/2 inch of headroom. I did the short-term storage method, so I let the jars cool to room temperature before placing the lids on and storing in the fridge. Let them sit for 1 day before enjoying. I'd say the recipe doesn't taste like a traditional pickle with the use of apple cider vinegar, but it was a sort of tasty gourmet flavor. The next 2 recipes come from Japanese Pickled Vegetables by Machiko Tateno. I bought this book for my mom while in Japan, and it was our first time trying out some of the recipes. The first recipe was the crunchy cucumber pickles. To make, cut 4 cucumbers, or about 1 pound of cucumbers, into rounds. Then thinly slice a 3-inch piece of ginger. In a saucepan, add 1/2 cup of soy sauce, 8 tablespoons of mirin, and 2 tablespoons of rice vinegar, and bring to a boil. Once boiling, add the cucumbers and ginger and stir to coat, then remove from the heat. Once the pot has cooled, return to the stove and bring the mixture to a boil. Remove from the heat once again and let cool. Then repeat the process once more. Once the pickles cool for the final time, they are ready to eat. They keep for 2 weeks in the refrigerator. These pickles were really tasty and flavorful, and best of all, pretty quick and easy to make with simple ingredients. The final pickles we made were yogurt pickles. To make, cut 4 cucumbers, or about 1 pound, in half. Place into a plastic bag and massage 1 1/2 tablespoons kosher or coarse sea salt into the cucumbers so that they are evenly coated. Add 1 1/4 cup of plain yogurt. Mix until combined, then store in the fridge for 12 hours before eating. These will keep for 5 days in the refrigerator. I have to say, these blew my mind. They were the easiest pickles to make and they were delicious. I can't recommend them enough. The yogurt added creaminess as well as a nice tanginess. The book says they go well with curries and spicy foods. After enjoying the bounty of our garden, I was eager to get back out there. Our kabocha squash was ready to harvest. I had hoped it would get a bit bigger, but the skin had lost its shine and dulled, and most tellingly, the vines next to the plant had turned brown, a sure sign it's ready for harvest. Compare that to our other kabocha, which was still a bit shiny and had green tendrils next to the plant. Not quite ready yet. By this point, it was already mid-September, so I was quite surprised to find 2 watermelons trying to grow. I really doubted anything was going to come of it, so I was shocked to find that only a few days later we had a watermelon about the size of my hand. I guess we can call September the month of surprise. Beyond finding some of the cucumbers we had been wondering about, and getting a watermelon, we also got 1 decent ear of corn, and found 1 surviving delicata squash that had produced something. Our mid-September was looking as productive as if it were the height of summer, with baskets full of cucumbers, tomatoes, ground cherries, a few peppers, and even some lemon squash from our remaining plant. But I did want to give a special shout out to the corner of death. Nothing I planted here has grown. I planted some arikara beans, which never came up. Then I planted another round of beans later, also to no avail. Has anyone ever had a corner that just didn't grow? I'm wondering if we missed this section with fertilizer or something. With the garden mostly thriving except for that little corner, and the foundation of the greenhouse complete, it was time to crack open the greenhouse kit and get to work building it. The kit we bought cost about $2,000. We were a bit disappointed in the plastic look of the greenhouse at first, but in the end I don't think it matters too much and it does look nice. Glass is just so much more expensive, so for now this is what we decided to go with. As for building the greenhouse, it wasn't exactly easy. There was much conferring over the instructions, trying to decipher what it meant and also what parts it was talking about. Labeling of parts wasn't uniform, and I feel like a majority of this build was looking for parts and trying to decipher the instructions. We definitely had to redo some parts several times and sometimes got stopped up by trying to figure out what we were supposed to do. You definitely need at a minimum 2 people to build this, but 4 was by no means a crowd. Something else to consider before building a greenhouse is your city's rules for building in your yard. Our area allows you to build something up to 13 feet in your yard without needing a building permit, though one of our neighbors did call the inspectors on us. So it's definitely a good thing to know the laws and rules before building anything like this in your yard. Because we knew the rules, it was a non-issue and resolved in 1 phone call. We were able to complete the entire framing of the greenhouse by the end of September, and just had to add in the panels. In total, it took us about 7 days with variable hours to complete this step. As September wound down, it was finally time to forage the wild burdock which grows abundantly in our yard. I had been waiting all summer to get a chance to harvest it, as the best time to harvest first-year plants is in the fall. Burdock is the plant commonly responsible for burrs you might find on your clothes when walking through a wooded area. This is how the plant spreads its seed. Burdock is commonly mistaken for rhubarb because the plant looks similar. The leaves and stems and roots are all edible, though different parts should be harvested at different times of year for the best taste. I harvested just the root, which grows deep into the ground and is best harvested by digging around the root. I was inspired to try it after seeing this great foraging series by Chef Sean Adler. I'll share the video in the description box. It can be strenuous work, but I had fun spending an afternoon digging the roots up. And I feel like I had a pretty nice harvest. Since it all grew naturally in my yard, it felt cool to benefit from the natural plants growing in my area. Burdock is more commonly eaten in Asia and is known for its medicinal properties such as aiding in digestion, removing toxins, and lowering inflammation. You can stew, fry, boil, and even pickle burdock, and Chef Sean Adler made burdock chips. But I decided to try it as a tea. I've heard burdock taste a bit like radish, but the texture was really different from a radish. When I tried eating it raw, it seemed really woody and didn't have much flavor. But when I put it in tea, it had an earthy and herbaceous flavor. I was also surprised by the color it produced. The tea was pretty good, actually. With only a few days left of September, the garden began to look a little tired and overgrown. Our cucumber plants began to die back, so we got any remaining cucumbers and cut back the plants. I went through and tried to harvest a lot of the remaining plants, like a large portion of our basil, our remaining squashes, some lettuce leaves, and some of our tomatoes. While doing that, I also cleaned up other tired-looking plants. I was surprised to find our okra had held on and grown despite being shaded out by the corn. Even though it grew, I felt like I didn't know when to harvest it. It was too tiny, and then by the time some of them got big enough, the texture was all wrong, spongy and dried out. The one I harvested here was all right, but I ended up not getting to eat any of the okra we grew. I would like to try again this year, but I feel like I don't know when the right time to harvest is. If anyone has tips for okra, it would be appreciated. I also harvested some of our yaya carrots. After fighting with the rabbits over it, we got a pretty good yield, also considering we forgot to thin these out, so they were a bit crowded. I really liked this variety. The purple color was beautiful and packs a higher antioxidant punch than the orange varieties. I like the flavor of these, and I'm excited to grow more this year. And even though the plants hadn't died back yet, I went ahead and did a harvest of our Murasaki Japanese sweet potato. They were rather small and stringy, but boy were they delicious. We cooked them up as pan-fried fingerling potatoes. Yummy. I also harvested my fall crop of radish, another disappointment. I'm really not sure what the issue has been with our radish this year. I had better luck growing them in our container garden a few years ago. I thought they would do even better with a bit more space. Perhaps they just weren't getting the nutrients they needed. Even though the radish harvest wasn't great this year, I attempted to make yolmu kimchi, or young radish greens kimchi, with our meager radish harvests. Of course, my radish varieties are not the same as a Korean radish, but I have a kimchi cookbook that includes a recipe using the French breakfast variety that I've made before, so I figured this would work out all right. I supplemented my radish harvest with some radish from the farmer's market that was about to go bad, as well as some Napa cabbage. I'll link the recipe I use in the description box below, though I made some modifications to work with what I had on hand. To explain the general process, you start by making a potato porridge. This is meant to be a quick kimchi ready to eat in a few days, so this helps to speed up fermentation. Boil some potatoes and blend with the water the potatoes were boiled in. Next, prep the greens. Since the radish is young, or in my case thin, you keep the young radish as well as the radish greens. I removed any bad leaves and cut off the long tails. Then I chopped some Napa cabbage, though the recipe calls for winter cabbage. Clean everything really well and salt the greens and let them sit in the brine for a few hours. Once the greens have wilted, rinse the salt off. After that, make the sauce. I was actually out of gochugaru, the red pepper used traditionally in kimchi, but I did have gochujang. So I used some small hot peppers and gochujang to make my sauce. Mix the greens in the sauce, then transfer to an airtight container. Cover everything with a salt brine, making sure all of the pieces are submerged. Let ferment for 1 day at room temperature, then you can transfer to the fridge for a week to continue to ferment. After a week, it should be ready to enjoy. If September was the summer we were waiting for, October quickly transitioned to fall, bringing with it all the beautiful fall colors. We got started with more garden cleanup, clearing away all our corn plants, just in time to use for some fall decor. We harvested our second bag of purple potatoes with a pretty good yield. We also got some more tomatoes, our first ripe fire and ice pepper, which wasn't very spicy. It was pretty mild and had a green, fresh taste. And I planted garlic of the elephant, music, and Great Lakes variety. We bought a rhubarb plant and I got that planted in the ground. I'm hoping it has survived the winter since we planted it in the ground a bit late. Our neighbors actually grow rhubarb, so I know it does well in the area. Rhubarb is something I haven't really eaten before until this year, but it's a fun flavor I've begun experimenting with after trying some out from the farmer's market. I made a pretty good rhubarb strawberry kombucha and would like to try that again. I also got some onions and harvested a few more carrots, which all went into a delicious carrot onion potato hash with fresh veggies from our garden. I also harvested our lima beans, our watermelon, a mysterious pumpkin hybrid that was maybe supposed to be our black futsu, and a few more cucumbers from one vine that was still alive, a few cucamelons, and one more okra. Our watermelon wasn't bright red, but it still tasted pretty sweet. I really am surprised we managed to get a watermelon. By the 14th of October, we had our first freeze warning, and northern Minnesota got their first snow, which meant winter was on its way. Our attention turned to the greenhouse. With the frame complete, we got the roof panels installed. We added the doors to the front of the greenhouse and got the pop-out window panels working on the very top of the greenhouse. Unfortunately, these are manual, so don't ask me how we will actually open them in the future. But they are to help regulate the temperature in the greenhouse as it heats up. And with that, the greenhouse was officially built. We cut away the bar that went across the entrance and finished the front of the greenhouse. Then we got a start on transporting dirt to get the inside of the greenhouse level. After a couple of cold days, we were able to get back out into the garden. With not much time left until winter really hit, we were focused on harvesting the rest of the vegetables as well as garden cleanup. I finished harvesting the rest of our potatoes. I also scrounged around for some more of the onions we planted in our open garden bed. We had an alright yield. I also harvested the rest of our yaya carrots. And we had also grown a bit of celery that we kind of forgot about and rediscovered. We only had one or two that grew. It smelled so good though. Then I cleaned out the bed. We actually needed to move and redo this raised bed. We used the dirt to help fill in and level the inside of the greenhouse. We also got our sunshade off in the main garden space and put away. And while we knew winter was fast approaching, some of our garden beds didn't look too concerned, and were still going strong. Our pepper plants and nasturtium looked happy, and we were still getting ground cherries. The next order of business for the greenhouse was to add cedar shingles to the outside wood foundation. This also helps protect the wood from the elements as well as add aesthetic appeal. We got the shingles from Menards for about $17 a pallet. We spent the rest of the day wrapping the greenhouse in protective film and then beginning to shingle the foundation. We used a chalker to line up the spacing for the shingles. Once the guidelines were in place, we could nail the shingles to the wood. We didn't want to buy a specialized roofing nailer, so we tried to nail the shingles in manually, which was a struggle. After an afternoon of that with little progress, we ended up just buying the nail gun, and my dad was able to breeze through it in an afternoon. With news of our first snowstorm for Halloween, I ran out to the garden and tried to harvest as much as I could of what remained. I got a lot of nasturtium leaves, all the tomatoes, our broccoli, and our peppers. After our Halloween snowstorm, the snow didn't stick around for long. On November 1st, we were back in the garden, and some of my fears about that being the end of the garden were assuaged. A lot of our plants looked like that had been nothing but a summer rain. And in fact, some of the garlic I had planted a few weeks before was already sprouting. I hope this doesn't affect their production for this year. I harvested our horseradish and we did our final garden cleanup. We put a tarp over the garlic bed and our frosted bloom garden was put to rest. From there, we focused on the finishing touches on the greenhouse. We finished leveling the ground, taking dirt from our cleaned up garden bed and from the remains of the large order of dirt we got in the spring. Once we got the inside as level as we could, we tamped that down, then laid some tarp. We added pebbles for the ground. With the inside coming along, we painted the outside of the greenhouse black. Then we added insulation on the inside of the greenhouse and added shiplap-style walls on the inside. With that done, we painted that black to match the outside. The final step was to get the doors on and painted. And we have a greenhouse. You can see how we decorated the greenhouse for the holidays in our Christmas in the Greenhouse Decorate With Me and DIY videos. We're already revving up for our 2025 Frosted Bloom Garden. One thing I think we want to try this year is square foot gardening. Garden planning can be one of the bigger challenges as a new gardener, and last year I don't know that we had the best plan. We had issues with cross-pollination and incompatible plant needs like our radish and cucumbers. Square foot gardening will allow us to get more bang for our buck and have a better plan. There were definitely plants that we really enjoyed that were new for us, like ground cherries and nasturtiums. This year we want to do more flowers as well. We liked the zinnia, but would like to add a bit more variety. The borage we planted, while pretty, wasn't very prominent. Some of the other flowers we tried planting never bloomed, like our calendula. We did plant some echinacea, which needs cold stratification, so we will see if any of that pops up this spring. Some of the most fun I had this season was thinking something had failed, only to find out it had actually worked, like our delicata, watermelon, and cucumbers. Of course, not everything was a success. Our fall batch of cucumbers never made it, and the infamous corner of death refused to grow anything. And we had our fair share of duds. But that's just part of gardening. Unexpected wins, inevitable losses, and everything in between. Now, as we look ahead to the 2025 season, I can't wait to get started again. Though with a few more snowstorms still on the horizon, even in March, our Frosted Bloom journey is only just beginning. If you want to see how we built this garden from the ground up, check out the video on the left. And if you missed our greenhouse holiday makeover, watch the video on the right. Thank you so much for watching, and remember, enchantment awaits. Life is just about finding it.